Her hands did not shake. That was the first thing the hall noticed, and the thing it would spend the rest of the night trying to forgive her for. Diana stood in the center of the great stone floor of the Ashfell den, with her palms turned up, scrubbed raw and red to the wrist where the lye soap had eaten into the cracks of her skin. And every wolf around her was trembling. The Alpha was trembling. The enforcers ranged along the wall were trembling, though they would later swear it had been rage. Even Safine, the senior healer, the polished knife at the Alpha's right hand, had a tremor in her thumb she could not quite hide against the silver cuff at her wrist. Only Diana, the accused, the bone setter, the one they were about to kill at moonrise, held herself perfectly still. The fire in the great hearth had burned down to bone-pale coals. The smell of the dead air lingered in the rushes, a sweet undernote of rot the bleach had not managed to scour. Her hands did not shake because she already knew the wound had not been hers to treat. She knew who had kept her from it. And she knew, in the same animal way she knew when a fracture was clean or splintered, that the thing she had been hiding in her ribs since she was 11 years old was not going to stay hidden much longer. What the Hall did not know, what the Alpha did not know, what Safine with all her tinctures and her smiling counsel did not know, was that the runt wolf Diana had supposedly failed to grow into was a story she had let them tell on purpose. The truth was sitting under her sternum like a coal that had never gone out, and it was beginning, very slowly, to remember it was a fire. The enforcer captain, a broad man named Jeffrey who had bandaged his own son in her workroom the previous winter, and not met her eyes since, stepped forward to read the charge. His voice cracked on the word negligence. He did not look at her. The Alpha, gaunt with grief, did not look at her. Safine was the only one who looked, and her face was arranged into the careful sorrow of a woman who has been practicing the expression for days. Diana looked back at her, and she let the older healer see, for the first time in years, exactly who was standing inside her skin. Safine's tremor traveled up from her thumb into her jaw. Outside, the bell for moonrise began to toll, and Diana opened her hands wider, palms up, an offering, an accusation, a promise. She had not killed the heir. She had not been allowed near him. And what was about to walk out of her body was old enough to remember, in its blood, every Alpha who had ever told a healer to step back. To understand what happened in that hall, you have to step backward, the way a bone setter steps backward from a body before she touches it, to see the whole of the break. 3 nights earlier, the heir of Ashfell, a boy of 19 named Isidore, had come back from a border patrol with a puncture wound in his thigh no one could quite explain. He had been laughing when they carried him in, bragging about a stag he had run down. The wound looked clean, almost surgical, and that was the first thing that should have been wrong. Boar tusks did not slice like that. Bramble did not slice like that. Safine had received him at the threshold of the medic's hall, with both hands and a clucking tongue, and Diana had stood in the side corridor with her bag already open, because she always stood in the side corridor on patrol nights, in case a wound came in too gruesome for the senior healer's stomachs. Safine had glanced over Diana's shoulder, met her eyes for a heartbeat, and said, mild as milk, that the bone setter would not be needed tonight. Go to your room, Diana. We have him. Diana had hesitated. She remembered that. She remembered the small tug in her gut, the same animal tug she had learned to listen to over a bedside, that said the wound under Safine's hands was not what Safine was treating it as. She remembered Isidore's young, scared eyes finding hers across the room, and how she had given him the small, steady nod she gave to everyone she could not reach. And she had gone. Because the Asheville Healers Hall had a hierarchy, and the bottom rung of that hierarchy was a girl whose wolf had never come in. And that girl did not argue with the woman who could end her livelihood with a sentence. She had gone to her room, and she had laid awake all night with the coal under her sternum glowing, and by dawn, the air was dead. The morning Isidore died, Diana woke to the sound of the death bell and knew, before her feet touched the cold stone, what was about to be done to her. She did not panic. Panic was a luxury for healers whose hands were trusted. She got up, she washed, she braided her hair tight against her skull the way her mother had taught her on the last morning of her mother's life, and she put on the rough gray tunic of her station, and she went to the medics' hall to do what protocol required, which was to present herself to the senior healer for assignment to the body. Safini was waiting for her at the door. So was Jeffrey. So were two enforcers whose names Diana did not yet know, but whose hands were already resting on the hilts of the iron-bladed knives the pack used for executions. Safini's eyes were red-rimmed. She had been weeping, or she had been rubbing them with something that mimicked it. Diana could not yet tell which. The accusation came out of Safini's mouth in the cadence of a prayer. The air had been brought in stable, Safini said. The wound had been deep but survivable. She had stepped out to fetch a tincture, and in her absence, the bone setter had been called in, against orders, by a junior medic now conveniently absent on a coastal errand, and the bone setter had cleaned the wound wrong, packed it wrong, missed the secondary bleed, and by the time Safine had returned, the air was beyond saving. The Alpha, standing behind Safine in his grief rags with his eyes hollowed out, did not ask Diana if any of it was true. He looked at her and through her and past her, to the empty space where his son should have been, and he said the words that turned a frame-up into a sentence. Blood reckoning. Moonrise. Diana heard the words and did not move. She catalogued instead the things Safine had gotten wrong on purpose, because a polished liar always salted her lie with errors a careless listener would skim. The junior medic had not been on a coastal errand. Diana had seen him at breakfast. The tincture Safine claimed to have fetched lived in a cabinet 6 paces from the heir's bed. And the wound, the surgical puncture wound that had come in laughing on Isidore's thigh, was not the kind of wound a bone setter would be called to in the first place. Diana said none of this. She had spent her whole life learning that the truth, in the Asheville den, was only as useful as the rank of the mouth speaking it. She inclined her head to the Alpha. She let Jeffrey's man take her arm. And as she was led from the medics' hall to the holding cell beneath the council floor, she let her gaze sweep, once, across Safine's face. And she watched the older healer's pupils contract. Safine had expected weeping. Safine had expected pleading. What Safini had gotten was a bone setter who was looking at her the way a bone setter looks at a fracture she has finally diagnosed. In the cell, Diana sat on the stone shelf with her back against the wall and let her mind go down into the place under her ribs where the coal lived. She had not visited it in years. She had been 11 the first time she had felt it, kneeling beside a hair she had been trying to splint, and the hair had been dying, and her chest had filled with a heat that wanted out. And her mother, her quiet, thin mother who had come to Asheville from somewhere none of the elders would name, had grabbed her by both shoulders and pressed her forehead to Diana's and said, in a voice like a vow, "Not yet. Not ever. Not here." Diana had asked why once, and her mother had told her about the war packs, the Crimson Line, the bloodline hunted to extinction across 3 generations for the crime of being able to refuse an alpha. Diana had been a child, She had not entirely understood, but she had understood that her mother was afraid, and that her mother died not long after, and that whatever was sleeping in Diana's chest was a thing she was supposed to lay over with weights and never lift. She had laid the weights. She had been a runt wolf in every account that mattered. She had let them call her broken. She had set bones and cleaned out abscesses and stitched the wounds the senior healers wouldn't touch. And every time the heat had risen in her chest, she had pressed it down with the discipline of a woman setting her own dislocated shoulder. She had been doing it so long it had become a kind of prayer. In the cell, with the death bell still tolling for Isidore overhead, Diana laid her palms flat on the stone, and for the first time since her mother had pressed their foreheads together, she stopped praying. The cell door opened in the afternoon, and the child came in. Diana had not expected the child. The child's name was Georgiana, and she was 6, and she was Isidore's younger sister, and she had brought a small wooden carving of a wolf in her fist. The enforcer at the door had let her through because no one in Asheville told the Alpha's grieving daughter no, even on a day when her brother's killer was supposed to be locked in stone. The child stood 3 paces from Diana with her chin set and her cheeks blotched and her hair coming out of its plait. And she stared, and Diana stared back, and neither of them spoke for a long time. Diana had set this child's wrist once, a fall from a pony. The wrist had healed clean. The child had brought her, afterward, a fistful of pressed violets and had hugged her around the hips the way small children hug, without permission, and had then run away before Diana could thank her. Diana had not forgotten. The child took a step closer now. "You didn't," she said. Diana looked at her. The child's lower lip wobbled and then steadied. "You didn't kill him." Diana did not answer immediately. She was a bone setter, and a bone setter did not lie to a child. And she had been raised by a woman who had taught her that the only thing worse than telling a child a hard truth was letting a child be the only person in a room who already knew it. "No," Diana said. "I didn't." The child's whole small body went loose with it, as if she had been holding a breath since dawn. She walked the last 3 paces and pressed the wooden wolf into Diana's palm and closed Diana's fingers around it. "He carved that for me," she said. "He said it was a brave one." Diana looked down at the small, clumsy figure, 4-legged, ears too big, a scratch along the flank where the boy's knife had slipped. Her throat did something it had not done in years. The child sat down on the cold stone beside her without asking and tucked herself against Diana's side, and Diana sat very still, because she could feel, against her ribs, the coal flare in answer to the child's small, warm weight. The wolf in her, the wolf no one knew she had, the wolf that had been bred to break alphas, leaned toward this 6-year-old like a hound leaning toward a hearth. It did not snarl. It did not hunger. It pressed its forehead against the inside of her sternum the way her mother had pressed her forehead to Diana's. And it was, Diana realized with something like grief, gentle. They sat for a long time. The child did not cry. She had cried herself dry already. She told Diana, in the run-on chatter of a child who has decided this stranger is safe, about how Isidore had been teaching her to whistle through her teeth, and about how Safini had told her she was too small to come to the body, and about how Safini's daughter, a polished girl named Maelis, who was being groomed to inherit the healer's hall, had told her she had to be brave now and not ask questions. And at the word Safini, Diana felt the coal under her ribs flare hot enough to startle her. The child felt it too. She lifted her face and looked at Diana with the unsettling clarity small children sometimes had, and she said very quietly, "Your chest is warm." Diana put her hand over the child's small one and held it there. "Don't tell anyone," she said. The child considered this with the seriousness of a treaty. "Okay," she said. Then, after a moment, "Is it a wolf?" Diana hesitated. "Yes," she said. The child nodded, as if this confirmed something she had already suspected, and she did not seem afraid. She seemed, instead, comforted, which was the part Diana would carry with her afterward as the worst and best thing that happened to her that day. Because if the child of the murdered heir could sit warm-handed against a werewolf and not flinch, then perhaps the thing inside her was not only the thing her mother had been afraid of. The enforcer at the door cleared his throat. The child was let out. She looked back once, and she did not wave, but she lifted the small wooden wolf in Diana's hand, as if to remind Diana she was holding it. And then she was gone. Diana sat alone in the cell with the carving in her palm and the coal in her chest, awake now, fully awake. And she listened to the moon climb in her bones. She did not pray. She had stopped praying. She thought instead about the surgical puncture wound in Isidore's thigh, and the tincture cabinet 6 paces from his bed, and Safini's daughter telling a 6-year-old not to ask questions. And she began, with a bone-setter's patience, to set the fracture of what had actually happened. By the time the enforcers came for her, Diana had assembled the break in her head. She had not been ordered away from Isidore because the wound was beyond a bone-setter. She had been ordered away because she was the one healer in Asheville whose nose could not be bought. The senior medics drank Safini's tinctures with their morning tea. The junior medics were her pupils. Diana, demoted to the side corridor, took her meals alone, and that was the only reason her body had not been slowly tuned to ignore the things Safini did not want it to notice. The puncture wound had been clean because it had been made by Safini's own lancet, after Isidore had been brought in with whatever lesser injury he had actually taken on the patrol. Safini had widened the wound and threaded it with something. Diana could guess at the something. The healer's cabinet held 3 substances that could mimic septic shock in a young, strong body, and Safini had access to all 3, and the one she would have chosen was the one that smelled faintly of crushed almond when it hit the blood. If Diana had been allowed in the room, she would have smelled it. She would have said something. She would have lived perhaps less than a week longer than Isidore had, because the senior healer of Asheville did not leave loose ends. The why of it was the part that had taken Diana the longest to set, because the why required her to think of Safini not as a healer who had snapped, but as a woman who had been planning this for years. Myelise. Of course. Myelise was being groomed for the head of the healer's hall, yes, but Myelise was also being groomed for something larger. The Alpha had 2 children. Isidore was 19 and had been formally named heir. The next in line, in the absence of Isidore, was a cousin Diana did not know well, a young man called Thorne who lived in a vassal hold 3 days' ride east and had no political ties to the Central Healers faction. With Isidore alive, Myelise's path to the den's inner circle ran through the slow politics of marriage. With Isidore dead and Thorne summoned home grieving and unmoored, Mylis had a clean run at a frightened young heir who would lean on whichever woman his mother's friend recommended. It was an old, old play. Diana had seen Safini make smaller versions of it for years, against rival healers, against vassal stewards, against anyone whose pliability she required. The scale of this one was new. The cost of this one was a 19-year-old boy who had been carving wooden wolves for his 6-year-old sister. Diana set the last piece of it in place, and the coal under her ribs flared so hard she had to put both hands flat on the stone to keep from making a sound. The cell door opened. Jeffrey, the enforcer captain, stood in it. He had a torch in his offhand and his iron-bladed knife in the other, and his face was gray. "Diana," he said. "Captain," she said. He looked at her for a long moment. There were healers' children Diana had set. There were enforcers' wives Diana had stitched. There was a daughter of Jeffrey's, 15 years old, whose collarbone Diana had reset in the dark on a winter night while Safini was at a feast. Jeffrey knew her. Jeffrey knew her hands. His mouth worked. "Walk straight," he said finally. "Don't make me drag you." "I won't," Diana said. He stood aside. She rose. The hall above the cell was full. The whole pack was there in concentric rings because a blood reckoning was a public thing, and Safini had made sure word had spread to the last vassal cottage. The Alpha sat on the high seat in his grief rags. Safini stood at his right shoulder in healer's white, with her hands folded. Miley stood behind her mother in healer's white as well, with the small private smile of a young woman whose long patience was about to be rewarded. The enforcer's line stood in a half moon around the open floor. The moon, the actual moon, was rising in the long window behind the high seat, and its first cold light was beginning to spill in across the rushes. Diana was led to the center of the floor. Jeffrey let her arm go and stepped back. The Alpha lifted his head and read the sentence, and his voice was the voice of a man who had not slept and would not sleep again. Diana let him finish. She did not interrupt. She did not plead. When he was done, she lifted her hands, palms up, the way she had stood at the start of the hall, and she said into the silence only one sentence. "Captain, you should ask Safine where she keeps the almond tincture." Safine's pupils contracted. Diana saw it. The whole hall saw nothing yet, because the words had not had time to land. But Safeni saw, in Diana's face, that the bone setter had set the brake, and Safeni moved her hand, very slightly, toward the silver cuff at her wrist, where Diana now realized she kept a second vial. The enforcers began to close. There were 4 of them, Jeffrey and 3 others, fanning in a slow, practiced arc that left Diana no clean line to the door. The iron knives caught the moonlight. The pack, in its concentric rings, held its breath. Safeni's hand finished its small motion toward the cuff at her wrist, and stilled there, fingers resting on the silver as if in absent grief. The Alpha did not move. He had given the order. He would not call it back. Diana watched the enforcers come, and she did the thing she had spent 20 years not doing. She let the weights off. It did not happen all at once. The coal under her sternum lifted, slow, like a coal lifting out of a banked hearth into air. And then it lifted faster. And then it lifted all the way, and Diana felt her whole rib cage fill with a heat that was older than her, older than her mother, older than the den. Her vision went red at the edges, not with rage, with light. A spiraling, banked red light that began to pour out of her sternum in slow, lazy spirals, the way smoke pours up from a fire that has just been fed. Jeffrey stopped walking. The other 3 did not stop, because they had not yet looked at her face. Jeffrey had. Jeffrey had seen something in Diana's face that had unlocked a memory in the deep part of his blood. A memory he did not consciously own. He took 1 step back. He said, very quietly, "Oh." The heat in Diana's chest moved up into her throat, and down into her hips, and out along her arms. And her hands, her bone setter's hands, scrubbed raw and red to the wrist, began to glow. Not human skin glow. Ember glow. The shift came in like a tide. It did not break her. She had been afraid all her life that when she finally let it out, it would tear her apart, the way her mother had implied it might. It did not tear her apart. It unfolded her, the way a piece of folded cloth unfolds when you stop pressing your hand against it. Her spine lengthened. Her jaw lengthened. Her gray tunic split along the seams her mother, in some forgotten foresight, had hand-stitched loose. Fur came in along her arms in the color of banked coals. Deep red shot through with veins of brighter ember. And as her shoulders dropped to the floor, her wolf rose into the space her body had been. And the wolf was enormous. And the wolf was crimson. And the wolf was lit from inside as if every hair were a thread of fire. The hall did not scream. The hall could not. Every alpha in the room dropped. The alpha on the high seat folded forward at the waist, both hands gripping the arms of the chair, his breath coming in ragged pulls as his own wolf, somewhere inside him, was forced to its belly by a thing his bloodline remembered and feared. The 4 enforcers fell to one knee, then to both. Jeffrey's iron knife slipped from his hand and rang on the stone. The lesser alphas ranged around the hall. Captains and elders and visiting vassals all went down in a slow, uneven wave, like a field of wheat under a wind. The non-alphas, the betas and the omegas and the unranked stayed standing, swaying, eyes wide, untouched by the command in the light, because the command was not for them. Safini was the only alpha-blooded woman in the room who did not drop all the way. She went to one knee, hard, with a sound like something tearing in her hip, but she kept her head up by force of years of practice, and her hand stayed on the silver cuff at her wrist. The crimson wolf turned its great head. The wolf was Diana, and the wolf was not Diana. The wolf was, more accurately, a thing Diana had grown over and around like a tree grows over a buried sword. And now that the tree had split, the sword was lifted, and the hand on the hilt was still, recognizably, hers. The wolf looked at Safini. The wolf inhaled. And what came in through its nostrils was not the smell of the hall, not the smell of fierce sweat and torch pitch and old rushes, but something finer, a layered scent that read Safini the way a bone setter reads a body. Diana felt it land in her own mind as a pattern. The herbal undertone of the woman's daily tinctures, the iron tang of nervous sweat, and under that, sharp and unmistakable as a fracture line, the smell of a lie told for so long it had soured into the woman's blood. It was not metaphor. It was a scent. It came off Safini in waves, and the wolf could read it the way Diana's hands could read a break under skin. And the wolf, being a wolf bred to break alphas, had not been bred to keep that scent to itself. The wolf opened its great mouth, and what came out was not a howl. It was a low, rolling sound that traveled along the floor and up the walls and into every nose in the hall, and the spiraling red light pulsed once with it, and suddenly every wolf in the room, dropped or standing, smelled what the crimson wolf smelled. Safini's lie hit the hall like a struck bell. Heads turned. Even the alpha, folded over his throne, lifted his face. His nostrils flared. His grief, which had been a wall, cracked. The alpha of Asheville, who had not looked at Diana once since dawn, looked at his senior healer instead. And the look on his face was the look of a man who had just smelled, in the woman he trusted most, the death of his son. Safini did not run. There was nowhere to run. The enforcers were on their knees, but they were on their knees from a wolf command, not from a human one. And a senior healer with a vial of almond tincture in her cuff could not outpace a hall full of noses that had just learned to read her. She did what polished liars do when their lie has gone bad in their teeth. She tried to speak. She lifted her chin and her voice was already shaping the next sentence. The salvage sentence. The one about how the bone setter's monstrous shift was proof of the dangers Safine had been warning the council about for years. How the werewolf line had been hunted to extinction for good reason. How the only safe course now was to put down both the accused and the truth she had wrapped herself in. It was a clever sentence. Safine had been building it in the back of her throat since the moment Diana's hands had begun to glow. She got as far as the word danger. The Alpha lifted one hand, not high, just enough. The whole hall went still around the gesture, the way a forest goes still around the lift of a predator's head, and Safine's clever sentence died in her mouth. The Alpha was not looking at the Crimson Wolf. He was looking at his senior healer, and he was inhaling, slow, the way a man inhales when he is testing a wound for rot. His nostrils flared once, twice. His face did a thing that Diana, with her bone-setter's eye, recognized as the precise moment a man stopped being a father and became, again, a ruler. "Safine," he said. His voice was very quiet. "Where do you keep the almond tincture?" The hall did not breathe. Safine's hand on her silver cuff went white at the knuckles. Melis, behind her mother, took one step sideways, as if to put a little distance between her white healer's robes and the woman she had been standing behind. And that small step did her in more thoroughly than anything else, because the hall saw it, and the hall scented it. The same sour line note coming off Melis in a thinner, more nervous register. Mother and daughter. The same fracture line. The Crimson Wolf did not lunge. The Crimson Wolf, in fact, did something Diana would not understand until much later. The Crimson Wolf sat, folded its enormous fire-lit legs and lowered its haunches to the stone in the center of the hall and rested its great head. And the spiraling red light dimmed, not out, but down to a glow that lit the rushes around her paws like coals in a hearth. The hall could breathe again. The Alphas on the floor stayed on the floor because the command weight had not lifted entirely, but the killing edge was gone, and what remained was something stranger and harder to name. A werewolf, at rest, in the middle of a reckoning, declining to kill the woman who had framed her. The Alpha understood it before anyone else did. He had been a ruler for 30 years, and he had seen wolves choose, and he saw Diana's wolf choose now. He turned his head. "Jeffrey," he said. The enforcer captain was on both knees and one hand. He lifted his face. "Search her cuff," the Alpha said. Safine moved. It was the only thing left to her. She twisted her wrist, and the silver cuff opened with the small, practiced click of a thing she had opened 100 times in private. And the vial came free into her palm, and she lifted it to her own mouth. Because a senior healer of Asheville did not kneel for a public execution if she could spare herself with a swallow. The Crimson Wolf moved. Not fast. Just enough. One ember-lit paw came down across Safine's wrist with the precision of a bone setter pinning a dislocated joint, and the vial popped out of the woman's fingers and rolled on the stone, and Jeffrey, still on his knees, scooped it up. He held it to his nose. His face went gray a second time. "Almond," he said. The hall exhaled. Safine, pinned at the wrist under a paw the size of her own torso, did not weep. Polished liars rarely did at the end. She looked up the long red length of the wolf to the wolf's face, and what passed between them was a thing only the two of them, and possibly the small girl who had sat warm-handed against Diana in the cell, would ever understand. "You should kill me," Safine said. Her voice was conversational. "Bred for it, weren't you?" Diana, inside the wolf, considered this. She let the consideration travel down the wolf's spine into the paw on Stephanie's wrist. The paw did not press harder. The paw did not lift. The wolf lowered its great head until its breath, hot and smelling faintly of iron and pine resin, moved the loose hair at Stephanie's temple. And then the wolf, very deliberately, looked away from Stephanie and looked at the alpha, and waited. The alpha understood that too. He rose from the high seat. It cost him. His own wolf was still pressed flat by the command weight, and standing under that weight was like standing under a stone. But he did it, because a ruler did not let a werewolf carry his sentence for him. He came down the 3 steps from the dais. He crossed the floor. He stopped at the edge of the wolf's red light. "Stephanie of Ashfell," he said, "for the murder of my son, and the framing of an innocent healer, and the long, quiet poisoning of this hall, you are exiled from the pack at moonset. If you cross our borders again, the enforcers will not be the ones who meet you." He glanced, only for an instant, at the crimson wolf. The wolf inclined its head once. Stephanie's daughter, behind her, made a small sound. The alpha looked at Melis. She would not meet his eyes. "You go with her," he said. "You knew." The hall scented the truth of that, too, and no one argued. The shift back was harder than the shift out. Diana had read, somewhere in her mother's few salvaged books, that this was always true for first shifts in suppressed lines, but reading and feeling were different things. She came back into her human shape in stages, on her knees on the cold stone, fur receding into skin in long, slow ripples, the ember light dimming under her ribs until it was, once again, a coal. She was naked. Someone, Jeffrey, she thought, put a cloak over her shoulders without looking at her face, because even an enforcer captain who had just watched her unmake the hierarchy of a hall understood that a woman returning to her body deserved a wall of cloth between her and a crowd. The alphas on the floor were rising in slow, uncertain waves. None of them looked at her directly. None of them quite looked away. Stephanie and Melis were led from the hall, not roughly, but not gently, in the strange formal stillness the Ashfell guards reserved for those they had not yet decided whether to mourn or curse. The alpha himself walked Diana out of the hall. He did not speak to her on the long walk to the healer's wing. He did not need to. They both knew what had been done to him, and what had been done to her, and they both knew that the apology he owed her was a thing no alpha had ever managed to speak aloud, and that the gesture of walking her, openly, the length of the den under the eyes of the pack was the only apology a ruler could offer without making it about himself. At the door of the healer's wing he paused. There were footsteps coming down the corridor toward them, small, fast ones. Diana knew before she saw her. Georgiana came around the corner at a full child run and crashed against Diana's hip and wrapped both arms around her legs and pressed her face into the cloak. And Diana, who had just stood under moonlight as a werewolf, who had pinned a senior healer under one paw, who had felled every alpha in a hall with a sound, put one shaking hand on the back of the child's head and discovered that this was the thing her hands had been waiting all night to do. The alpha watched. He had lost a son at dawn. He was watching his daughter cling to the woman who had been blamed for it. And Diana could see, in his face, the careful work of a man rebuilding, in real time, the shape of what his family was. He did not pull the child back. He nodded once to Diana and turned and walked away down the corridor with the gait of a man who had aged a decade between sunset and moonrise. Inside the healer's wing, the senior medics were already arranging themselves in a hasty receiving line, because the politics of the den had inverted in the space of an hour, and they were trying, visibly, to remember which side of the line they had been standing on. Diana walked past them. She did not need to make a point of it. The Crimson Wolf had made the point. She went to her own small room at the back, the one with the side corridor door, and she sat on the narrow cot with the child still wrapped around her. And after a long quiet while the child slept, and Diana sat with her hand on the small back rising and falling, and looked at the wooden wolf carving Isidore had made, still clenched in her fingers, and she set, for the first time that night, the break in herself. She had wanted, badly, to kill Safini. She had not. She had wanted, just as badly, to kill Maelys. She had not. The wolf in her had been built to kill alphas, and the wolf in her, faced with two of them within reach, had instead sat down. Diana did not know yet whether that was something the wolf had chosen or something she had. She did not know yet whether the choice would be available to her every time, or whether tonight had been a gift she would not be granted again. She knew only that her hands, when she lifted them off the child's back, were not red and raw anymore. The lie damage was gone. The cracks were closed. The wolf had healed them on the way back through. A bone setter's hands in a bone setter's body, with a war wolf coiled in the chest. She would have to learn what that combination was. She would have to learn whether the scenting of lies in blood would dull with time or sharpen, whether the dropping of alphas would happen every time she shifted, or only when she meant it, whether a child could grow up safe with her hand on her head. She would have to learn whether she could ever again walk into a hall full of her own pack without watching for the moment they remembered to be afraid of her. The cost of the night settled on her shoulders like a second cloak. Not grief, not triumph. Something quieter than both. A long obligation. She had not been hunted to extinction. She had survived, by accident or by her mother's foresight, into a den that had forgotten what she was. The forgetting was over. Every day after this one, she would have to choose, in the small private hours and in the loud public ones, not to be the thing her bloodline had been bred to be. Healer, not breaker. Setter, not severer. She looked at the carving in her hand, the clumsy wolf with the scratch along its flank. Isidore had made it for his sister. Isidore had been 19 and learning to whistle through his teeth. Diana closed her fingers around the carving until the wood pressed into her palm, and she promised the boy, in the quiet way bone setters promised the dead, that she would learn the new shape of her hands and that she would keep them careful. The weeks after the reckoning were the strangest of Diana's life, and not in the ways she had expected. She had expected the pack to flinch from her, and some of them did, briefly, the way people flinched from a fire they had not yet learned the manners of. She had expected the senior medics to resign or to scheme, and a few of them tried both before the Alpha quietly reorganized the healer's hall with Diana, now at its head, an appointment she had neither asked for nor refused. What she had not expected was how ordinary most of it became. She still set bones. That was the part that surprised her most. She had thought, with the wolf awake in her chest, that the small, careful work of her hands might feel diminished, or that her patients might come to her with the wrong kind of awe in their faces. They came instead the way they had always come, except that now they came through the front door instead of the side corridor. And now they were not afraid to look her in the eye when they did. A vassal woman with a snapped wrist, a junior enforcer with a dislocated shoulder, a child with a green stick fracture in the forearm from falling out of an apple tree. Diana set them. Her hands knew the work. The coal under her ribs sat quiet through it, the way a fire sat quiet in a hearth on a long winter afternoon. And there were whole days when she almost forgot it was there. And there were whole days when she felt it stir for no reason, and had to put her hand flat on her own sternum, the way she had once put her hand flat on a stone cell floor. The blood scenting was harder. She had hoped, in those first days, that it might be a thing she could turn off. It was not. Every patient who came through her door arrived carrying a small cloud of their own truths, and Diana, who had spent her life reading bodies, now read also the cloud. And the cloud was not always kind. A merchant's wife came in with a bruised cheek and a story about a fall, and the cloud told Diana the husband. A young man came in with a fevered hand and a story about a wood splinter, and the cloud told Diana a knife from a fight he was not supposed to have been in. Diana said nothing in either case. The wolf in her wanted to. The wolf in her wanted to walk into the merchant's house and look the husband in the eye and inhale. Diana did not let it. She set the wife's cheek, and she gave her the address of a vassal hold 2 days' ride east, where a woman could go and not be followed, and she let the merchant's wife decide for herself whether to go. She lanced the young man's hand and told him to find a better fight or none at all, and she let that be the end of it. She was learning, in small daily increments, that a werewolf's nose was a tool, and that a tool in a healer's hand was not the same thing as a tool in a soldier's. The child came every day. Georgiana had appointed herself, without ceremony, Diana's small shadow, and the alpha, whose grief had taken on a quieter, steadier shape, did not forbid it. The child sat on the high stool by the window and watched Diana grind herbs and ask questions and run-on chatter about everything. And sometimes, when a patient came in with the kind of injury that needed quiet, the child went perfectly still on her stool, and Diana found, to her own surprise, that the child's stillness steadied her hands as much as her own breath did. The wolf in Diana's chest learned the child's smell within the first week, and treated her, from then on, like a small, warm coal of its own. There was no flaring. There was no hunger. There was only the soft attentiveness of a large predator that had decided, on its own, that this small creature was a thing to be kept. Diana watched the wolf decide. She did not interfere. She let it teach her what it was. Thorn, the cousin from the eastern vassal hold, arrives 9 days after the reckoning to be formally named heir. He was 23, tall, narrow-shouldered, with the unsmoothed wariness of a young man who had grown up far from the central court and did not entirely trust it. Diana was presented to him in the hall as the head of the healer's hall, and he looked at her the way a man looked at a creature he had heard stories about and was still deciding whether to believe. He did not bow. He did not flinch either. After the formal presentation, he came, on his own, to the healer's wing, alone, without retinue, and he stood in the doorway of her workroom with his hands behind his back and said, "I would like, if it is permitted, to ask you some questions." Diana looked up from a mortar of dried yarrow. About the night," he said. "I have heard 6 accounts. None of them agree. I would prefer, if you are willing, to hear yours." Diana set the pestle down. She studied him. The cloud around him read, to her newly tuned nose, like cold river water, clean, a little anxious, no rot. She inclined her head to the stool the child usually sat on. "Sit," she said. He sat. She told him. She did not soften it and she did not embellish it. She told him about her mother. She told him about the coal. She told him about Safeni's lancet and the almond tincture and the small, careful step Milese had taken sideways. She told him about the wolf sitting down. He listened without interrupting. When she was done, he was quiet for a long moment, and then he said, "The part I keep thinking about is that you sat down." Diana lifted an eyebrow. "Most people," he said, "keep thinking about the dropping." He met her eyes. "I keep thinking about the sitting." The wolf under her ribs stirred, mildly, the way it stirred when the child was particularly still on her stool. Diana noticed the stir, and she filed it, and she did not yet know what to make of it. She poured him a cup of the bitter herbal tea she kept for visitors who needed steadying, and he took it, and they sat for a while without speaking. And when he left, he thanked her, formally, and bowed, shallowly. And Diana, alone again with her mortar and her yarrow, found that she had not, in their whole conversation, scented a single lie. She did not see Thorn again for some weeks after that, and when she did, it was not in the healer's wing, but in the orchard behind the den, where Diana had taken to walking in the late afternoons because the child liked the apple trees, and because the wolf in her chest, for reasons Diana did not entirely understand, liked the smell of cold fruit and bark. Thorn was already there when she came up the path with Georgiana's small hand in hers, sitting on a low stone wall with a book open on his knee, and the careful distance kept between himself and the women's path through the trees. He rose when he saw them. He bowed to the child first, gravely, and the child, who had appointed herself an arbiter of all visiting cousins, considered him for a long moment and then bowed back with a 6-year-old's ceremony. Diana watched the exchange and felt the coal in her chest shift again, in the small, unfamiliar way it had shifted in her workroom. She did not yet name it. She was not ready to. She inclined her head to him. He inclined his back. The child ran off to the third tree from the wall. The one she had decided last week was hers, and began to climb. And Diana, after a small pause, sat down on the stone wall a careful arm's length from Thorn, and did not look at him. They watched the child climb. After a while, Thorn said, "I have been reading." "About what?" "About the war packs." He kept his eyes on the child. "I went to the Western Archive. They have 3 books on the Crimson Line that I think have not been opened in 100 years. Diana said nothing. The wolf in her chest had gone very still. He turned the book on his knee around. It was a small thing, bound in cracked leather. "There is a passage," he said, "that I thought you might want." He read aloud. "The Crimson Line," he read, "was bred in the Third Age by the war packs of the Southern Reach for the breaking of unjust command. It was understood by the elders who shaped them that a wolf bred to break an alpha must also be bred to refuse the breaking when it was not just, or the line would become a tyranny of its own. The elders therefore wove into the line a second nature, a healing instinct, so that every wolf of the Crimson would be born with 2 hands, one to break and one to mend, and would be required, by its own blood, to choose between them daily." He closed the book. He did not look at her. The wolf in Diana's chest sat down again, the way it had sat down in the hall, and she felt, for the first time since her mother had pressed their foreheads together, that her bloodline had not in fact been hunted to extinction for being able to kill alphas. It had been hunted to extinction for being able to refuse to. The distinction mattered. The distinction mattered more than she had words for. She looked at Thorn. He was still not looking at her. He was a young man who had grown up far from court and had learned, somewhere, the courtesy of giving a woman who had just been handed a piece of her own history the privacy of her face. She breathed in. The cloud around him read, again, like cold river water. No rot. A small new note of nerves. "Why?" she said. "Why give me this?" He turned the book over in his hands. "Because if I'm going to be the alpha of this pack," he said, "I would like to be the kind of alpha whose healers do not have to hide what they are." He paused. "And because my cousin," he said more quietly, "made my sister a wooden wolf. And the woman who is teaching my sister to climb apple trees is the one who pinned the woman who killed him. I would like," he said, "to deserve both of those things being true at once." Diana sat with this for a long time. The child, in the third tree, had reached a branch she was not supposed to reach, and was looking down at Diana with the particular guilty triumph of a 6-year-old who knew she had been caught. Diana lifted one eyebrow at her. The child grinned, came down 2 branches, and stopped at a more reasonable height. Diana turned back to Thorn. "I do not know yet," she said, "what I am." "I know." "Then how do you propose?" "I do not propose anything," he said. He said it carefully. "I do not, in fact, propose." He glanced at her finally, briefly, and his face did not have the look of a man making a play. "I am asking, only, if I may sit on this wall sometimes when you walk in the orchard, and read to you, if you would like, what the archive has, and perhaps, in some long while, if you found it of any use, eat a meal at the same table." He looked back at the child. "That is all I am asking for now." The wolf in Diana's chest did not stir. The wolf in Diana's chest did the thing she had only ever felt it do twice before, when she had set a vassal woman's wrist 3 days after the reckoning, and the wrist had clicked into place under her hands, and when Georgiana had pressed the wooden carving into her palm in the cell. The wolf steadied. Diana noticed the steadying, and she counted it, because she had been counting them. This was the 3rd. She had told herself, in the privacy of her own ribs, that the steadying was a thing she would permit herself to feel only 3 times before she decided what to do with it. 3 was a bone setter's number. 3 was the number of times you tested a joint before you trusted the reset. She let the steadying settle. She did not name it. She did not let her face show it. She inclined her head to Thorn, the way she would have inclined her head to any wary equal who had brought her a useful book. "Sit on the wall," she said. He nodded. "Read me what the archive has," she said. He nodded again. "As for the meal," she said, "ask me in a year." He smiled, very small, very careful, and went back to looking at the child in the apple tree. And Diana sat on the stone wall beside him with her hands folded in her lap, and felt the cold orchard air moving through her hair, and thought, with a bone-setter's precision, that she had perhaps learned something new about what it meant to be a thing bred for breaking, which was that the work of choosing, daily, not to break, was a thing one did not have to do alone, even if one did it without ceremony, even if one did it with an arm's length of stone wall between oneself and a young heir who had not, once, in the whole conversation, told a lie. Georgiana fell out of the apple tree 2 weeks later. It was not a serious fall. The branch she had been forbidden to climb gave under her, and she landed in the long grass under the tree with a soft thump and a more startled than hurt cry. And Diana was across the orchard before her own conscious mind had decided to move. The child was sitting up by the time Diana reached her, holding her left arm at the wrist in the particular careful way that meant green stick fracture. And her lower lip was wobbling, but she had not cried yet, because she was Isidore's sister and had decided long ago that crying was something she would do only when she felt like it. Diana knelt. She took the child's wrist into her hands, gentle, gentle, and she let the bone setter's eye look first and the wolf's nose look second. The fracture was clean, a small one. It would set easily. She told the child this in the calm voice she used with patients of every age, and the child nodded, breath hitching, and Diana reached up and brushed the child's hair off her wet forehead, and as she did, the coal under her ribs did the steadying for the 4th time. Diana noticed the 4th. She had told herself 3. She let the 4th pass without correction. There were, perhaps, going to be more than 3. There were, perhaps, in fact, going to be a great many, in a life given over to the small daily work of choosing the mending hand over the breaking one. She would have to recount later. For now, she set the child's wrist in the orchard grass, with Thorn, who had come at a run when he saw them go down, kneeling on the other side and holding the small shoulder steady, and the 3 of them did the work of mending in the cold afternoon light without anyone needing to say very much. When it was done, and the child was splinted and being carried back to the den on Thorn's hip with great dignity, Diana walked behind them along the orchard path and looked at her own hands. The lie damage was gone. The fur had taken it on its way back through her on the night of the reckoning, and her hands now were the hands she had been given as a girl, before the den had decided what to make of her, before her mother had pressed their foreheads together, before the coal had ever flared. A bone setter's hands. They were the same hands. They were not the same hands. She turned them in the afternoon light. She thought about Safini, who was, last she had heard, alive in some eastern hold, and would, Diana suspected, remain alive only so long as she was useful to someone who did not yet know what she was. She thought about Melis, who would never wear healer's white again. She thought about her mother, who had pressed their foreheads together and said, "Not yet, not ever, not here," and who had been wrong about the not ever, and right about the not here. She thought about Isidore, the boy of 19 who had carved a wooden wolf with a scratch along the flank for a small sister who had survived him, and she let herself feel, for a long, quiet moment, the particular grief of having been kept from his bedside on the night he died. She had not killed him. She had also not saved him. Both things were true. Both things would, she suspected, be true in her hands for the rest of her life, and there was no shift, no scenting, no awakening of any bloodline that would unmake the second one. That was the cost. She accepted it. She kept walking. At the den door, Thorn handed the child off to her father, who had come down at the news, and the alpha looked at his small daughter on the heir's hip and looked at Diana behind them, and did the small grave nod he had given her on the corridor on the night of the reckoning. Diana inclined her head back. She would not be invited into the family. She did not particularly want to be. She would be, instead, the head of the healer's hall, and the woman who walked in the orchard, and the bone setter who set the child's wrist when the child fell out of trees she had been forbidden to climb, and the thing the den had quietly decided not to be afraid of, mostly, most days. It was enough. It was, in some ways, more than she had ever imagined being allowed. That night, alone in her small room at the back of the healer's wing, with the child asleep in the guest cot Diana had set up in the corner 2 months ago and never put away, Diana sat on the edge of her own narrow bed and put one hand flat against her sternum and felt the coal there. It was quiet. It was awake. It was hers. She thought about how she had stood, that first night, with her hands held flat and steady in a hall of trembling wolves, and how the open loop of that steadiness had finally closed, not in the moment of the shift, but here, in the small, ordinary act of having set a child's wrist in an orchard. Her hands had not shaken because she had known the wound wasn't hers to treat, and she had known who had kept her from it. Her hands did not shake now because she had finally been allowed, by the slow and accidental grace of having survived, to treat the wounds that were hers. She blew out the lamp. The child made a small sleep sound from the corner cot. The coal under Diana's ribs banked itself down. Outside the window, the moon was waxing toward the first quarter, and somewhere, in some eastern hold, a senior healer was, perhaps, lying awake and smelling, on her own skin, the lie she had soured into. Diana lay down. She did not pray. She had stopped praying long before, and she had not gone back to it, and she did not think she would. She closed her eyes. There were a few moments in this one that have stayed with me. The hands held steady in a hall of trembling wolves. A 6-year-old pressing a wooden carving into the palm of the woman they had locked away. And a werewolf, with the means to kill every alpha in a hall, choosing instead to sit down. I would love to know which one landed for you. See you in the next story.